Okay, so tonight we're going to talk a little bit about self and self in Ruby. So first, I want to talk a little bit about self. Actually, want to ask everybody about their comfort level with self. So I learned this from somebody that I had speak at a meetup that I help host, and he was a former teacher. So it's this thing he calls, but I can't see you, so it's not going to work as well. But he called it fist to five, and you hold your fist in front of your chest, and fist to five is how comfortable you are. Zero, fist being equivalent to zero in our instance here. So that would be like you haven't ever heard of self in Ruby, and five being you're a self master and you should be teaching this study group, and we should all be listening to you type of feeling. So from 0 to 5, just throw it into the chat. How comfortable do you feel with self as a concept? All right, 2, 3, 3, 1.5. I don't know how you do 1.5 if we were doing the fingers thing, but that's cool. Okay, cool. So that's, I think, about perfect, and where most people fall, because self has some very straightforward implementations, and then you can get into some really abstract, weird things that it can do and that can happen at times. So I think most people fall in the 3-ish, 2 to 3-ish range, because I think we all know that we know enough about it to do stuff with it, but we also, I think, understand that we don't know some of the really abstract, more obscure uses of self and how it works. And I think that's healthy, that we know that we don't know. So I'm just going to start a little bit with, what we think about self is, because it can be baffling sometimes. It's always changing, and depending on its context, but it's never explicitly shown in our code. So we're just kind of always expected to know what it is. Sometimes it's explicitly shown, but rarely is it explicitly shown. It's just, you're supposed to know what self is at any given moment in time, at any point in your code. So a lot of problems that people face are caused by not understanding self, especially beginners in Ruby. So if you've ever, quote unquote, lost an instance variable, or you've been puzzled over what data is visible to a mixin, if you even got into mixin point of time, or it's probably because didn't understand self in the context. And so we're going to look at self in a few different situations, and hopefully come out with a little bit better understanding of what self is and how it works in different contexts. And hopefully we come out better and with a better understanding than we had coming in before this. So tonight, as we're going through this, if you have any questions, any comments, throw them into the chat. I will take a look at it. I do have the screen that you see up on a different monitor than where my chat window is. So I sometimes get zoned into that screen in this code editor, and I won't look over to the chat as often as I should. But I promise you I'll get to it if you throw it into the chat. If you want, if you don't want to lose it, or you just want to stop me in my tracks, just throw it out. Turn on your microphone. I'm all for you interrupting me so we can make sure things are clear. And I'll do my best to check in and make sure that you guys are following along. So, make sure that you're giving me some feedback. So I'll ask throughout, hey, are you guys keeping up? Does this make sense? Can I clarify anything? Go ahead. Feel free to ask questions. Say something doesn't make sense. This is all about learning, and I want to make sure everybody is solid on the things that we go through tonight. So I want to go through a few different examples. So don't worry too much about the overarching code. If you're seeing something, I'm going to show some different examples. And if you see something that, you haven't gotten to yet, Don't worry too much about the actual, the grand scheme of the code and what's going on. Let's just, kind of zero in on what self is going to be in these examples. And if you have questions about it too, just ask. But hopefully I can explain it well enough that we can figure it out. So I'm just going to write a little bit of code. Singing. And so we're going to look at 3 examples, specifically when we use self when setting and getting instance attributes inside a class definition, using self to denote a method within the class definition as a class method, and self to reference the calling object within an instance method definition. And these are going to showcase 9 out of 10, applications, so to speak, in general, of where self is commonly used. So it might not be where we see it most in the curriculum, because we're looking at starting from the beginning and illustrating things throughout the process, but I'm looking a little bit more at where self ends up in applications typically. We need this. All right. So now let's open up an IRB session. Actually, let's put a pry session in here. I don't know if I'll hit that. I can't remember if I have to call something or not. Ruby self2.rb. Oh, that. Okay, we won't hit it right there. So let's just do IRB. And we can play around with this some. Okay, so now we have our code in IRB. So in this example, let's get this easier to see. And there we go. That's probably a better setup for this lecture. So in this example, we've created both a simple class to describe a person with this code here, and a simple module. This module gives the person the ability to sing by including it right here. So while we could have simply added the sing method to the person class, well, instead we're assuming that we wanted to use this sing method other places in other classes, so we wanted to make it a module so we could use it in other classes later on. So for this reason, we dried out our code and made a module instead of just simply including it in the person class. So let's look a little bit at, or let's make some stuff. So let's say Seth equals person dot new Seth. So now we have our person. And if we say Seth.sing, Seth and I'm singing, if we just look at sing, get undefined local variable, if we say singable dot sing, undefined method sing for singable module. So the sing method here is referencing the name attribute of the calling object. And in this IRB session, the calling object is a person named Seth. So this is an example of using self to reference the calling object within an instance method definition. So this is our instance method, and we're using self right here to reference the calling object, which is a person object with the name of Seth. So since the singable module was included within the person class, any method defined in the module will be inherited by the class as if it was originally defined in the class. So in this case, it's being called from the Seth instance of the person class. So it returns that person object. This is also going to be an example of using self when getting or setting attributes within a class definition. So the sing method that we have in Singable uses string interpolation to insert the name attribute right here of the calling object, which in this case is Seth. This object here. And it's pertinent to always remember that this is the object that we have that we're working with right now. So since the method is being called by a person object, self references that specific instance of the sing method and reads the name attribute. So self isn't, in this instance, referencing singable at all. Singable is being included into this person class. So this self references this person object, which in this case has a name of Seth. So this, if we make it a little bit clearer, it's almost like taking this and just having it here. That's basically what this include is doing. We're taking everything in this module and interjecting it into this class. So that's available for us to use. Some space in there. Okay, so are we keeping up? Is this making sense? Yes, no, any questions at this point in time? Okay. Why the error? So which one are we looking at? Let's reference these two let's call this one 17 and this one 18. Okay, no method error. Or name error. Both. No problem. So this one, we're showing that self only has a meaning in the context of a Ruby class. So therefore, it can only be called within an instance method or a class method. So this module isn't going to be giving it anything to work with. So that is going to be talking about the number 8 or line 18, singable.sing. It's going to say undefined method sing because this module in and of itself doesn't have methods. So these methods are only going to become available when they're included on a class. Does that clear that one up for you?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. And then, let's see, that was this one. And then this name error is saying undefined local variable or method sing for main object. So right now, if we look at what, in the context of this IRB terminal, we define some code, we have a module and we have a class that includes that module, but as far as the terminal goes, you know, just the raw Ruby terminal, it's just sitting there. We've created one variable, which is this Seth, which is an instance of a person, and this is this object here. When we talk about sing, we're seeing a return of a different self. So this IRB terminal has a self as well. So we just type self here. We'll see main. So main is going to be the top level object. So everything in Ruby is attached to an object. So even when you start up an IRB session, there's this main object that is kind of all encapsulating everything. So it's the starting, the kind of the object that is over it all, because everything has to be an object. So even this terminal is an object of main. So when we see this name error here, we're seeing that there's no or undefined local variable or method sing for main object, because what happened when we just called sing was the terminal was trying to call sing on main, on this main object. And it's not available there. The main object is just, it's implicitly there all the time for us to build our other objects on. It's just Ruby, you know. So that's where we get this name error with undefined local variable or method sing for the main object. We haven't created it yet for this main component, and
Yeah.
we wouldn't want to attach things to main. We want to build, you know, things like modules and classes, and those are from that main object. Does that make sense on that one?
Yeah, that makes sense. I get it. Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool, good. All right. So we're looking at self, and, you know, we want to look a little bit more about what self is exactly. And let's look a little bit more in referencing the calling object. So let's extend this some. I'll call an existential crisis. just throw self in here. And I'll get a new terminal going. Let's get this covered in here. Actually, no. Okay. Then let's create our new person again. And let's say S equals Seth existential crisis. And then Seth.name and S.in. All right. So now looking at this example, we see that when we talk about referencing the calling object, we're talking about the returned value when that, or that means that the return value of the expression is equal to the object that made the call. So in this case, we see self is equal to the person object, Seth, saying this on both of them, because Seth, this Seth object, called this existential crisis method. And we can show that they're both equivalent to the same object by calling .name on both instances and seeing that they both return the name Seth. We can also see it just in what's returned here by seeing that the object has the same number address. And this is typically what I look for when comparing objects, if I have access to this level of detail. Because sometimes you will have objects that are, say, person, with the same name, but they'd be two different objects. So just to illustrate that, we can create another person with the same name. Oh, it probably shouldn't be Seth. Two. We see we have another person object with the same name, but it has a different address here. So these are two different objects. And that can get confusing at times when you have objects that are looking exactly the same. You need to see that. So we've explored object attributes as well as instance methods some. And there's another implementation of self that's worth looking into. So now let's keep track of how many person objects we're creating by updating this class sum. So we have our include and our accessor. I like having the space. No space there. We got our initialize. Oh. Crowd. Here, let's increment that. Oh. Is this new piece of code making sense? That this self is going to reference the object that's created. Have to make sure that I remember to check in. I get going and I forget. All right, so let's do this. All right. Oh, let's not get pry. All right, cool. So let's, all right, create some people. And we'll talk about it a little bit. So we have one person. Harley and Jay. And Denise. So got two more. Go for it. Kristen. And then Sophia. All right. And then if we call person.population, we're going to get 5. And if we call something like h.population, oh, move that out the way. Okay, we got undefined. So something that some people who are new to object-oriented programming or just programming in general have difficulty understanding is the difference between a class method and an instance method. So not going to dive too deep into that, but really the instance methods are behaviors that can only be operated by an instance of a particular class. So by one of these persons, these people, whereas class methods are behaviors that can only be operated by the class object itself. So even though we don't have a bunch of this class, so to speak, being created, we're having instances and objects being created, this class is still also an object, which we need to remember. So everything in Ruby is an object. And that's how we can call this person.population, because we have that object to call it on. So before, when we called Seth.existential crisis, in that example, we employed an instance of the person class. And in that case, the instance was Seth, and that's where we called the method on, that person. So in a similar way, we can call methods on any class itself without initializing or creating a new instance of that class in Ruby. And that's actually what we've been doing all along with these news. So when we're calling person.new, Ruby is interpreting that as our initialize method. And it's a special case for classes because we don't have to use the self keyword in this instance. So new is another way to say initialize. And it's also taking care of this kind of part for it, where we don't have a self call in there. It's just part of the structure of Ruby itself. When you call .new, on a class, you're hitting this initialize, and it's all connected for us already. So what we did here to show this a little bit, and kind of, there's a self there that we don't even see, is that we created this population class method. So when we're creating a class method, we're defining it on the class itself. So that's where self comes in. We're saying self is this class here, and that's where this method's going to go. Whereas these are instance methods that are going to go on the objects that are created from this class blueprint, so to speak. And we have this crowd, which is a class variable. And that we're going to increment every time a new person object is created. So in IRB, we created what? 5 people, or 5 objects. And we can observe this when we execute the population on person in C5. And we did that by denoting self before the method name. This is an example of using self to denote a method within the class definition as a class method. And here, we're illustrating that if we try to run the same method as an instance method, it will not work. And that is because it is a class method. Do all class methods have self? Yes. There is, well, before we start looking at some other things, this was the meat of what I wanted to get through. So any questions up to this point? We can look at some other things that I have notes on, but these were really the 3 big things, or quote unquote main things. I guess big is a relative term. Any other questions at this point in time? This making sense to everyone? Okay, so you asked about, or sorry, I don't want to just say you. Harley asked about class methods having self. Do all class methods have this self? And I said yes. Now, let's say you wanted to create a bunch of class methods. There is a popular shortcut for defining lots of class methods at once. It's actually 2 more lines of code, but it kind of, I don't know, some people like it, but it's popular. So I'll show it to you and how it works. So let's say we wanted another, let's set another method that we'd want. Let's call this all. And let's do edit all push self. I think that'll work. Let's double check my code, make sure this works right. And let's say def all Data all. All right. Trying to get all this code into one screen where it's easier to see. Okay. Just double check that this works as I believe. Enter, let's say, person.new. Person.all. Okay, yeah, cool. And let's just put this as name. So we'll just put all the objects in there. Actually, okay. Let's go through this one more time. Put a few objects in there so we can call. All right. Actually, I just want to illustrate the class level methods. So person.new Seth, person.new Emma. Emma is the very small child you might hear in the background a little bit. Person.new Olivia. And that's her sister who's asleep, or should be asleep at least. Okay. Now if we call person.population, like we showed before, 3, we call person.all, we get an array with all the person objects in it. So that's cool. Now to show you, I want to go through this to show that it works, and we can see the same exact functionality with some different code. So a way that we can refactor this is to get rid of these selves and class self. Let's get all this formatted in and copy that. We'll go through this one more time to show that it's working the same way. Then I can dive into a little bit of how this works. Person.new, person.new, person.new. Okay. And then person.population, person.all. So this is, like I was saying, a popular shortcut for defining lots of class methods at once. So we don't have, in this instance, the self dot and self dot. And what we're doing here is this class inheriting from self is pretty interesting, actually. So it's letting us access an object's metaclass, which is also called the singleton class or eigenclass, which is just something deeper if you want to look into it more. But all you really need to know is that the metaclass is where Ruby is storing methods that are unique to a specific object. So let's look at how can we do this? Class self. Let's see, puts self.inspect. Should output for us. There we go. Yeah. So this is the output that we're getting from this put self.inspect. So this is showing that we're getting the meta class of the class person. So that is going to be the class that is going to be specific for the object. I know that's a little more abstract and obscure. And these are the type of things where we start getting into like, okay, I know that I can put self inside of a method and it's going to refer to something, or I know I can put self inside of a class and, you know, create a class level method. But having a class inherit from self on the meta class to define class level methods is definitely where we get into that point of like, I know that I don't know type of thing. Like I was talking about all the way at the beginning of this evening and this lecture. So don't worry if you don't completely understand this. Really, I was just trying to show you this popular shortcut here to define a bunch of class level methods and kind of group them together like that. Like I said, you're not saving lines of code. You're saving selfs. I guess if you have 20 or 30 or 40 of them, it really adds up in organization and kind of keeping things together. I'm honestly never written class methods like this, but I just haven't written a lot of them. You know, I always have maybe one or two type of thing. So we're coming up towards the end of the hour. This evening we looked at a few different things, but all based around self. We looked at self's use when setting or getting instance attributes inside a class definition. Things like this. We've looked at using self to denote a method within the class definition as a class method before we change this using a def self.all or def self.population. We've looked at using self to reference the calling object within an instance method definition, which is actually this. Miss said that, spoke a minute ago. This was looking at where self works or where its context is. We looked at self on the meta class, which is kind of cool, and things that we can do with that. We saw that there's this main object, and we just call self, when it's not in a part of anything. And that's code running outside of any class. There's always going to be that self. It's pointing to main, which is an instance of object. If we do self dot, where'd my cursor go? Self dot inspect. Yeah. So, any questions at this point in time? If they're really deep about the meta class, I'm not going to have the answer. I still don't understand that very well. It's just something that it's kind of cool that I ran across looking at and creating this lecture. Good. I'm glad you think or this lecture was helpful for you, Denise. Not that you think, you know that this lecture was helpful.